Okay, I think we will get started then. Thank you to you all for joining us this afternoon for this webinar to support the A-level set text selection. We are joined this afternoon by Professor Catherine Steele and by Jaspal Ubhi, who are going to lead us through they're going to lead us through Cicero. Thank you ever so much to all of you for your questions that you've submitted in advance. We have tried to factor as many of those into today's presentations, but we would like to keep this as informal as we can. So feel free to use the chat function if you'd like to ask a question to either Catherine or Jas as we go through. Or if you'd like to unmute and ask a question directly, we'd also welcome that. There's going to be plenty of opportunities for questions today. So without further ado then, I'm going to hand straight over to Catherine. Thank you, Catherine.
Well, thank you. Hello, everyone. I think what I'm going to do for maybe about 25, 30 minutes is try to give an introduction to the speech in terms of how it works as a piece of oratory and the historical background. It is a very technical speech, and inevitably there are some things I'm going to skate over. So please do put questions in the chat or raise them at the end. If there's anything I'm have skated over too fast or you want to explore in more detail. So the first thing I would say about dealing with any Cicero speech is it is so important to read it quickly, and that means reading it in translation. So I would recommend that as a first step. It's very difficult, I think, to get one's head around what Cicero is doing in this speech without that overview. And the passages that have been set for Latin within the A level really don't make any sense if they're just floating there. Obviously, lots of translations out there. I find the one by Dominic Berry in the World's Classic series really helpful. Got a useful introduction and some notes as well, but obviously there are lots, and it doesn't kind of really matter which one uses. The text for this speech is not really problematic. The other very helpful thing to have to hand, obviously rather more expensive, but as a reference work, I think it is valuable, is the commentary on the speech by Andrew Dyke, which is a Cambridge Green and Yellow. I'm sure everybody knows that, but that is always my first port of call for technical questions about what's going on, whether it be Latin or whether it be in terms of process or background. Right. So I have to say, I think this is a really weird speech to have said. There's lots that's problematic about it, and I have also to say, and this is probably the stupid thing that nobody should say in this seminar since it's being recorded, and it comes back to why I said read it in translation. Cicero read slowly can be a peculiarly agonizing experience. He only works if you read him quickly, because that is what was happening in the court, and it's that experience of being exposed to Ciceronian rhetoric and argument combined with the beliefs that the jurors have brought to the court with them that come together to create persuasion, and that's a process that's happening over a period of hours, not over a period of weeks or months. It is a difficult speech, I think, to make to work in this context, but there are things that we can do, hopefully, to make it more interesting. So, what, when, where, who, why? Basic questions about Roman oratory. We're in the year 80 BCE. We can't really specify much beyond that. We've got some internal and some external evidence to help with the dating. We know that, or at least Cicero tells us, and this is the kind of information that we can probably rely on because it would have been so easily falsifiable. Cicero tells us that the man whose murder is being explored at this trial died after the 1st of June 81. So we're obviously post that, and some months post that, given what has happened since that in terms of the narrative within the speech. And probably enough to take us into 80. And the other reason for thinking we're in 80, apart from some wider political considerations about Sulla's position, is the fact that Quintilian tells us that Cicero was 26 when he delivered this speech, and that fits with his birth date, which is confirmed for January the 3rd, 106. We are in the Roman Forum, at the Quaestio de Sicaris et Veneficiis, the knifeman and poisoners court, which is the murder court at Rome. And we're probably at the first time this court has met since Sulla seized power at Rome 18 months or so earlier. Right. And that we'll come back to, because that's quite an important point in why this speech is so politically significant, and what role it is playing in the what we might call the Sullan res publica. But it's a murder trial. The defendant, Sextus Roscius, is accused of having procured the murder of his father. He didn't actually do it with his own bare hands. There's no suggestion that he actually committed the deed, but he is accused of having procured his father's death through an attack in the street at some point in the recent months, but after June the 1st, 81. It's being tried at this particular Quaestio, but at least as far as Cicero tells us, it's a very special type of crime that falls within the ambit of this court, because it involves the murder of a parent by a child. And there is some very emotional writing in the speech, which talks about the particular penalty that the defendant would face if convicted, in terms of being sewn up in a sack with live animals and thrown into a river, which very much suggests that this kind of crime is regarded as in some way polluting and in need of some sort of form of expiation, that it's not just a capital penalty, which of course could often be evaded by going into exile. It is something more than that. And of course, one of the arguments that Cicero uses against it is that it's culturally inconceivable. Cicero is the defense advocate. Roman law is perfectly comfortable with the idea of advocacy, unlike, say, Athenian law, so you can get somebody to speak on your behalf. And in a way, advocacy also relates to prosecution. There is no state body which undertakes prosecutions. Prosecution is a matter of private enterprise. In this case, the lead prosecutor is a man called Gaius Erucius, and he's assisted by Titus Roscius Magnus. And they have chosen to bring this prosecution. So they have gone to the praetor and they have asked for permission to bring this charge. That permission has been granted, and a court has been summoned to hear the case. Cicero is the only advocate for the defense. That's not a structural feature. There could be a team, but in this case, he's the only man who speaks. And it's probably worth just pausing a moment on the question of the Quaestio. Now, insofar as we can say very much about early Roman law, it looks as though originally the Roman people as a whole have a monopoly over the imposition of capital charges. So that's why in Livy you have all these charges, these trials before the people, and so on. And that process was still in place in the late Republic. We do know of some occasions where people are tried in front of the people. But from the mid-2nd century BCE onwards, there had been a streamlining to this system, and it was probably designed as a streamlining, not as a power grab by the elite, though it also had that effect, of establishing standing courts. And this started with provincial extortion in the mid-2nd century BCE, the so-called Quaestio de Repetundis. And this meant that there was a court with a presiding officer, who would be a Roman magistrate, and jurors, an album, a kind of list of jurors who could be called to hear a case. And it was a large jury. The number seems to have fluctuated. It's not the case that there had to be X number or the court didn't work. Somewhere in the region of 50 to 70 men on a jury. So it was a big jury, but also a jury that could lose people during the trial, and that didn't seem to cause the trial to collapse. So the number and prosecution and defence could object to jurors. So by the end of the trial, we may have fewer than that, but it's still a large body. And the Quaestio system is extended through the 2nd century BCE to cover charges such as treason, and I think violence. There's a pre-Civil War Quaestio Deui, I think. And one of the things that Sulla has just done as dictator, so within the last year or so, is pass legislation to establish a suite of quaestiones to hear various types of charges. He doesn't seem necessarily to have changed the legislation very much where there was already existing legislation. But we've got standardization, and we've also got jurors who are drawn exclusively from the senatorial class. That has been a bit of a political football over the last few years, and Sulla has come down very firmly in favour of the most conservative shaping of the courts, which is only senators can sit on jurors. So Cicero is talking to a body of senators when he is delivering this speech. And again, that's quite significant for the politics of this speech, and I'll come back to that in a moment or so. Okay, so that's what's going on here. In terms of people and place, what's the charge? Well, the charge is that this young man, Sextus Roscius, Amerinus, by the way, is not part of his name. That's just an extra descriptive adjective from Ameria that was given to this speech in order to distinguish it from another speech in which Cicero defended a man called Roscius. So it's really just editorial convention. This young man is accused of having murdered his father. The reason we're actually even in a quaestio is because these are wealthy individuals, right? There's money involved. And Roscius the elder, the man who was murdered, was a wealthy landowner. He lived, or he was based, in the city or the town of Ameria, which is north of Rome, up the Tiber Valley. Good fertile agricultural land, and he owned 13 farms. So he's a major landowner. And because of the way the Roman political system worked, he would have been probably pretty influential figure, well, very influential figure locally. But he would also have been, he would have had connections in Rome. And we know he spent time in Rome, and he was friends with members of the elite, some of whom have stepped in to protect his son. So his son is accused of having killed him. Okay. Right. So how does Cicero try to defend him against this charge? Well, I've already mentioned that Cicero tries to argue that no Roman son could ever murder his father. But he also develops a very elaborate argument, which is an alternative explanation for what is going on. So rather than try to unpick the prosecution piece by piece and say, whatever claims they made, that didn't happen like this, or there's an alternative explanation, or so on, he more or less ignores the prosecution's case against Roscius and instead tells us a completely different story about what has happened. So to that extent, it's quite an interesting defence. It's quite difficult to reconstruct the prosecution speech from what we've got. It's much easier in other Cicero speeches where Cicero engages much more directly with what the prosecution actually said. Here, he has a different story to tell, and that is a story about a plot. Right. So the whole thing is there is this enormous plot of which his client, and also by extension, though he's less interested in the dead man, but his client is the victim. And so what is this plot? Well, two relatives of the defendant, also called Roscius, so they are clearly part of the same gens from Ameria, but the precise degree of kinship isn't specified. Magnus Capito, Roscius Magnus and Roscius Capito have combined in order to seize the elder Roscius's property. That is the purpose of the plot. It's to get hold of this valuable land. And in order to do this, they have fraudulently inserted the elder Roscius's name on the proscription list. And in order to do this, they have teamed up with a freedman, a former enslaved person who had belonged to Sulla, has been freed by Sulla, is now a freedman, a man called Chrysogonus, a Greek name, which gives us a hint as to where Chrysogonus came from. His name now, of course, as he's a Roman citizen, is Lucius Cornelius Chrysogonus. And the three men, so Cicero says, have joined forces, inserted the elder Roscius's name on the proscription lists. That means that the elder Roscius's property is now forfeit to the state. And when the res publica has sold it off, they've been able to buy it at very advantageous prices and are now in possession. So that is what this has all been about. It's about getting hold of property fraudulently. And we can imagine that Cicero has created this plot, and the proof that he can offer for it is very largely the fact that he's working back from an observed fact. That is, we can assume, I think, because it would have been too easily falsifiable, that the elder Roscius' name was on the prescription lists, that his property had been sold, and that it was now in the possession of Capito and Magnus, and possibly Chrysogonus also. Not entirely clear how Chrysogonus benefited financially from this deal, but so that seems to be the situation. And Cicero is working back from that, the result, and saying that was the planned end from the outset. And in order, therefore, to explain it, we can create a plot in which Magnus and Capito are responsible for Roscius's death, because without Roscius's death, the rest of the plot couldn't be initiated. And all that's fine. It's a great story. It's complicated and it's elaborate and it's full of skullduggery, and it involves kind of journeys by well-meaning people who are foiled by evil forces. Plus, kind of it allows Cicero to do that thing that the Roman elite quite like doing, which is kicking freedmen who are have got too big for their boots. So there's a lot of invective against Chrysogonus that centers around his inappropriate ambition and luxury. There's nothing I think that Chrysogonus is doing that wouldn't be okay if he were a member of the Roman elite, but he's not, right? So it's entirely inappropriate that he should be wealthy and have fine Corinthian bronzes and all the stuff that Cicero says he's got. Right, fine, okay. But there's something really weird going on here. Because if we step back and think about it, the fact that the elder Roscius' name was on the proscription list is a cast iron defense for his son. So we need to pause and circle around and think about the prescriptions. What were they? So, very potted history of what comes before, and apologies for if this is entirely kind of unnecessary to recap. But in 88, Sulla was consul, and his opponents, his political opponents, tried to deprive him of the military command he had been allocated against King Mithridates. In the Eastern Mediterranean, in what is now Turkey, Mithridates of Pontus. Sulla sees off that challenge and takes his army with him to the east, where he campaigns reasonably successfully, but not entirely decisively against Mithridates. But in his absence, his political opponents regroup and effectively seize control of Rome. So when Sulla returns from his campaigns against Mithridates in 83 BC, or possibly 84, a civil war rapidly breaks out. And this civil war only ends towards the end of 82, when Sulla wins a battle outside Rome and then seizes control of Rome militarily, and has himself declared dictator. And at this point, the dictator, although it is an office that exists at Rome, hasn't been used for over a century, and hasn't ever really been used in the sense of taking complete charge of the state. The dictatorship is a kind of emergency office when there's a crisis and you need somebody to do something. And actually, if we look at uses of the dictatorship, there's a brilliant article by Tim Cornell on this. A lot of it is not really emergency stuff. It's just the Roman state doesn't have quite enough magistrates. And sometimes you just need an extra pair of hands and you appoint a dictator to do something. And it may not be a task that we think that's a crisis office. Okay, so sort of changes the nature of the dictator. He seizes control. He makes himself autocrat at Rome. He does so under with the rationale that he is dictator re publicae constituendi, to restore the res publica. And part of that is around changing in some ways, the form of the Roman state. We've already looked at the legislation that he passes. He enlarges the Senate. He restricts the rights of the people. So there's a whole set of political and institutional change. But the other thing about the dictatorship is he eliminates his enemies. This isn't a transfer of power at Rome from one social and economic class to another, but it's a narrowing of the elite to eliminate Sulla's own enemies. And he does so by inventing the prescriptions, and the prescriptions are death lists. So a list of names is posted in public at Rome, and if your name is on that list, you have now lost all the protections that you had as a Roman citizen. And in particular, you can be killed with impunity. If you are murdered, I mean, you're not murdered, you're just killed. And no action will be taken against your killers. And the property is forfeit to the state, which can do what it wants with it, which usually is selling it off to Sulla supporters. And your children are excluded from political rights. And the prescriptions were violent and awful, and many men died. But it did mean that if Cicero had stood up in court and said, this case is a mirage because the elder Roscius name was on the prescriptions list. We cannot take any action against his killers, whoever they may be. That should have been an end of it. So why doesn't Cicero do that? Well, we speculate at this point because he doesn't ever address that particular issue directly in this speech. But the other thing I think that we need to bear in mind is that the existence of the prescriptions is also makes the case quite high stakes for Magnus and Capito, because they are, by suggesting that Roscius Elder had been murdered, they are implying that he wasn't prescribed. And if he wasn't prescribed, why on earth are they now in possession of his estates? Right. And I suspect that what is going on here is that the prosecution, and Arucius, of course, himself had no connection, no obvious benefit from what had gone on. So, he is a front man, though as the case develops, Magnus joins him as an associate prosecutor, which I think is interesting. But I think the point of the prosecution was to force the younger Roscius into publicly accepting the fact that his father had been prescribed, even though his father had not been prescribed, by using the defense that said, my father was prescribed and therefore he was killed justly. Doesn't matter who did it, we can't take any legal action. And if he'd done that, he would have accepted the legitimacy also of his loss of property, that there was nothing to inherit, right? Because his father was prescribed and his father's property forfeit to the state. And therefore, I think that what we have here is the client saying to his defense advocate, do not take that tactic because I still believe that I can get my property back. And I'm not willing to publicly accept that my father was prescribed when he wasn't. We don't, alas, know what happened after this case. Because by the end of this case, Roscius has been acquitted. We know that. But that acquittal has no implications, as far as I'm aware, for the wider political context. Because on its own, I don't think it would have invalidated the fact of prescription. The way that kind of the legal force of jury decisions doesn't seem to have been that clear cut. And we don't know what happened. We don't know whether the younger Roscius was subsequently able to get any of his property back. Don't know anything about that. We just know he was acquitted in this case. But that's the best explanation I can come up with for why Cicero doesn't take the easy and completely secure line of defense in this speech. But I would be very interested if anybody's got other thoughts of what might be going on here. Because it's high stakes activity, particularly if the penalty was, as Cicero suggests it would have been. Okay, well, I've been babbling for far too long, so I just want to move briefly onto the wider context here, because one of the issues in the secondary discussion of the speech is Cicero's attitude towards Sulla. And in particular, there's the passage towards the end where he talks about Sulla being like Jupiter, and some people have argued that this is a sort of satirical later insertion into the speech and so on. So what is Cicero doing in relation to the state of the nation? Well, I think the first thing to say is that this cannot but be a really political speech. Okay, it marks the moment, if you think about it, where we move from killing being publicly legitimated through the prescriptions to a point at which we're now saying there are certain forms of murder that are unacceptable within the res publica, and we will punish them. Now, the fact that Roscius was acquitted doesn't really undermine that. We are moving from lawlessness back to lawfulness. And we're doing so in front of a senatorial jury. And we're doing so in a way that, as far as I can see, absolutely maintains the Sullan status quo, because Cicero is very careful to isolate the nature of the problem. Right. The problem is not Sulla. The problem is not even the Sullan res publica. The problem is Chrysogonus. So we have this sense that there is a small and containable problem area that Sulla, in his infinite wisdom, will of course deal with once he's realised about it. But there's nothing to suggest that the state as a whole is unsound. What is the problem, and this is why the very final paragraph of the speech I think is really interesting, is that there's been a loss of humanitas. Cicero says we have all become brutalized through the terrible experiences of the last 18 months. Doesn't allocate blame as to who's responsible, but he says we've become brutalized and we can now afford and should become more lenient. We should become more civilized. Right, we can afford to do that. And that seems to me, again, to be a vote of confidence in the fact that the Solon Res Publica is here, it is here to stay, and we can make the best of it. We can actually make it a good place to be Roman citizens. And none of that seems to me to be particularly surprising, right? Cicero is talking in front of Sulan senators. Many of them will have been appointed directly to the Senate by Sulla. Sulla enlarges the size of the Senate, and he does so in a situation where its numbers have shrunk as a result of extended civil war. So a lot of these men are, Sulan appointees, loyal to Sulla, probably benefited personally from the events of the last 18 months. They don't want to hear anything which suggests that they are part of the problem. They're part of the solution. Well, part of the solution is acquitting this nice, innocent young man who's been caught up in this terrible story, which doesn't actually implicate Sulla. It's just an unfortunate side effect of the necessary stuff that's going on. And again, this kind of fits what we know about Cicero at this point. He's not the Cicero of later history. He's a young, ambitious advocate, starting to think about his political career, though it's going to be, 4 or 5 years before he can actually stand for office, wanting to make his name, but wanting to make his name within a regime that looks pretty well established by this point. Okay, that I think is enough by way of kind of starting an introduction. I will hand over very gratefully to Yas for the more detailed exposition.
That was hugely informative. Thank you, Catherine. Otherwise, we will turn our attention then to thinking about how we might go about teaching this text in the classroom. And I will hand over to Jas.
Okay, brilliant. So I'm going to do something a little bit different from some of the other ones. I'm going to step back to take a sort of top-down view as to what makes set text difficult, what makes this difficult, and how we can alleviate that. Because I think, as Catherine's rightly pointed out, this is a weird set text for A level, and there are some ins. We can actually make this a lot more manageable. So I want to start by this concept of lexical load. So when I was a student, we were told consistently that if you know 4 out of 5 words of any text, you can basically read it with a lexicon, which, by the way, never ever felt true to me. I remember having 4 out of 5 words on Hittite and getting nowhere with it. And actually, the academic research on this for modern languages suggests that it's at least 95%. So that's the major study from 1986. 95% was the point at which most learners could achieve at least 55% of a translation. So even so, that's not very high. Subsequent studies raised that quite substantially, in my opinion, to 98, 99%. The most recent, which is Kreml, which was 2023, which, if you're at all interested in this, I do recommend you read, because it's a really good, it's open access and free online, but it's got all this data there for you, and it's very experiential. They're testing set text unscenes in English for English as secondary language learners with different levels of text, 80, 90, 95, 98, and 100, to see at what point students can actually do something with the text. And they find that, right, 95 to 98 is still the cutoff, but there's basically a linear relationship. So the more words you give them on the page, the better they can read. So does this mean we can make this speech really easy if we just give them all the words on the text? If only it were that simple. That is not the case at all. And there's a couple of reasons why this doesn't work for Latin. How you define a section is something that's never clear. The studies I look at are using things like newspaper articles, websites, and so on and so forth. But in our subject, there's a huge difference between an epistolary piece of writing from like Pliny and then some really obtuse verse. Latin is, frankly, much more grammatically and syntactically complex than even the hardest English prose. And one thing that I want to go on in a bit is the paralinguistic features, which is something we spend a lot of time talking about in the PGCE: culture, genre, historical elements of it. So we can't just give them the words and let them go and let them run amok with it. And one of the best articles you can read on this is this one, Latin's 3 Dirty Little Secret. And it's talking about the issue with university students who have had fantastic Latin training to this date. But when you give them a bit of Caesar, which is meant to be quite easy, or Cicero or Pliny, it all goes to hell. And he's trying to explore why that is the case. And he focuses on this idea, originally developed by a guy called Hirsch, on cultural literacy. And we're going to talk about why this is relevant in a sec. But this is the example they give. And I really love this example. I suspect in England, this is probably less crazy than in the Americas, but I know nothing about critic, and despite being a fluent speaker, a native speaker, reading this, there are lots of things that require a bit of extra help. So, for example, there's a place in Atlas Triangular. Where is that? What's the meaning of that? There are lots of names. There are words that we know that are used in different ways. A 70-run victory, numbers 256 for 4. What does any of this mean? Windies, that's some more weird names. Obviously, it's the West Indians, but you can kind of see where simply knowing the language and having access to a really good lexicon doesn't help us at all. And when we look at something like a speech like this, that catapults to 100, 200 times in terms of difficulty. There are a huge amount of what I would call implicit knowledge in reading a speech like this, most of which obviously we will have because it's our subject. We've loved it for many, many years. We are, it's in the blood, so to speak. But with these kids, they're, 15, 16, 17, they wouldn't have had that exposure. And it's really easy to overestimate what they know. And, I could have filled 2, 3 slides with the things that they may not actually know that you need to understand for this text. So, for example, we casually throw things like the Roman Republic around, but how many of our students know what a republic is, let alone that it's a late Roman Republic, let alone that we're heading up to the fall of the late Roman Republic. Cicero is a really obvious one, not just who he was, but his career, his writings, this concept of being a novus homo, which is very, very important. And I think it's really important, the background of this. Why else did Cicero, of all people, take this speech? And actually, in the exordium, he spends a lot of time sort of hinting at this, that there was no one else to take it. The civil wars, especially the Sullan domination, that's something that I'm not going to really know at all. The Roman legal system. I don't know how many of you are very comfortable with the Roman legal system. I am not at all. So even the elements of the trial, which the kids kind of need to know, that can be quite difficult. Oratory as a genre, this is the big one. I don't know how many of you have ever had the really weird experience of telling year 11 class that actually next week we're going to do an assessment on the verse, and then to ask, well, which one's the verse and which one's the prose, because that is the level of genre knowledge that we're dealing with, at least where I teach, oftentimes. So that's before you get into breaking down verse into epic and love elegy and the different elements of prose. With the sort of middle school here, the attitude is very much, look, poetry is the fancy stuff, prose is what we're speaking in. But of course, prose genres have their own rules, regulations, and structures, and they do kind of need to know that for some of this. So I've laid out some of the difficulty on the cultural historical background as well as a linguistic background. And now we're going to move into talking about how we can mitigate this. So on the cultural historical side, there's lots of wider reading they can do. Some of this will be non-fiction historical stuff, and you can add in your book of choice here. I have found consistently that Rubicon by Tom Holland is by far the best for getting the kids to engage with this period. It's got the right level of accuracy, complexity, and pizzazz, if you will. But I'm sure lots of other things work specifically on or by Cicero, and it might seem a bit odd that we're promoting them other works by Cicero, given that we're talking about the difficulty. But maybe that can help. I found that I think it's just called Cicero's Life and Times by Catherine Tempest. That is the one that can be excerpted really easily to give to sixth form kids, and that does quite well. The Life of Cicero by Plutarch does surprisingly well. I'm not really sure what it is about this text, but students can engage with that really well. Translations. Catherine mentioned that Cicero should be read fluently, should be read speedily, and that is definitely the case. I always suggest the students get one of these two books. I don't really care which one, murder trials versus defense speeches. I think the defense speeches, I mean, they both have our set text. The defense speeches might be a little bit better, but I don't think it's to the degree where, a 16-year-old is really going to care that much. Fiction. Do not discount fiction for allowing students to immerse themselves in this world. I must admit, like most males, to be honest, I'm not much of a fiction reader, but it does sort of work. The Cicero trilogy by, I think it's Rupert Harris. A couple of years ago, the previous school I was at, we used to issue those for the kids doing Class Civ for the Roman politics module. and it worked very, very well. There's no reason why it can't work well here. I found with a bit of research that Roman Blood by Stephen Saylor effectively talks about this case. So that'll be a good one. As to rhetoric, there's a book, it's called the New Survey series. They have something on oratory, and that I've used before, and it's pretty good on this. But this leads us to the question: is this effective? Is this efficient? Well, it's certainly effective. To what degree it's efficient, again, that is a problem. Is it more efficient to give them some extra reading compared to you losing a lesson or two talking about this stuff? I think so. But again, your mileage may vary with how malleable your students are. I've been pretty lucky that if anyone is staying with us all the way to the sixth form, they're pretty diligent and they will read at least one or two things. But the best case scenario is we are 33% of their A level study in total, so we can't expect too much of them. So maybe have a read of this, a bit of picking and choosing. One of the questions that came up was, how do you get them to handle Roman oratory? How do you get them to sort of engage with this as a genre? How do you get them to remember what's really happening? And before we go on to the text, I wanted to share something that we do in year 10, in year 11, all the way to year 12. And that's we pretend that we're Romans, basically. So this is a speech. This is actually student work. They've long left the school, so they're not going to mind me sharing this. So I've given them a speech. This is a modern political speech. I will say, by the way, do not do what was done to us most likely at university, where you were given Gladstone or whatever and asked to put it into Greek prose. It will not work. You will then spend more time than ever before explaining who these people were and the words that they're using. Any modern speech, so Trump, and this is a Trump speech, by the way, Clinton, both Clintons, Obama, Tony Blair, Alistair Campbell, anything like that will work really well. The best run I've had with this exercise is using one of our Reverend's Christmas speeches from a few years back. You just need a paragraph or something, get them to read it out loud, give them a few sort of terms, and ask them to sort of highlight. Is this done tremendously well? Well, I mean, we could argue with some of these aspects. You can see that this particular student seems to think that everything is a tricolon, but I like the fact that they've pulled that 1960s, 70s, and 1990s, the way those dates are done. There's an element of variety there. I thought that was pretty good. And they're actually engaging with it. And this was that point, yeah, 10 student. And you give them this time and time again. It can be a starter, it can be a bit of extension, it can be a bit of homework, but get them to get reps in is the way I would think about this. And they'll get a lot better at analyzing direct speech. Here's an example of extension for this. I rewrite the speech without any of the rhetorical figures so that it resembles daily speech, and get them to contrast and compare. This starts off very much in a very basic exercise in diction, but after a while they will become more sensitive to this sort of thing. And if they can be more sensitive to this in English, they can eventually, hopefully, be more sensitive to it in Latin. Okay. Two other things that I found really helpful. Again, these are confected from the ancient world, but Aristotle's taxonomy, is it an ethical argument? Is it pathetic? Is it logical argument? They sort of really everyone can do this, and it gives the kids a way in. One of the things that we only have about a year of experiment with is borrowing this from Cicero himself, the Exordium Narratio Divisio, and seeing if they can write mini speeches like this, give them a speech. Ask them what element of a longer speech you think this is from. Ask them if they can refute it. I know, for example, certain handbooks use different meanings. So sometimes the Divisio, they use a different term. I can't remember what Dyke uses in his commentary. This does work quite well. It's a bit more abstract, but I would say that these sort of exercises are good things to do as you're warming up to do it. Okay, let's put it together and look at the text. So I mentioned problems with vocab, and I think that has to be put aside next to lexical problems have to be put aside to cultural problems, historical and contextual. I would argue that we also need to talk about genre in that, hence why we do specific exercises on speeches. And I think it can be just as important for proper comprehension. By the way, I think it's just like this for the verse as well. I think the difference is with verse, we all expect to be a bit perplexed, and we allow ourselves to be. But that's not really often the case with prose. I think students often feel that they should get it, and that's where some of the stress and annoyance comes from. And it's okay to explain that, prose can be just as complicated. Okay, so let's talk about lexical load in this speech. So I examine the text against the AS vocabulary list. I assume that most schools, certainly the ones I have worked in, we give them the AS list and we ask them to learn that, and we assume that that's their baseline vocabulary. So I examine the text against that. I adjust for place names, for people, and for what I very loosely term technical and legal vocabulary. And by the way, this is a really fun debate to have. What counts as technical vocabulary for the law in your department? So I've added things like CAIDES. My department did not like that. Accusata was considered a bit too obvious, but something like this is quite a useful thing to have. And we actually, you can see that some of these terms like judicium comes up all the time, maleficium comes up all the time. So this idea that you can give these kids a very specific vocab list and that they are asked to learn to it beforehand. And if it comes across in a passage, you can use that as part of the starter. So sorry, going back to what we're talking about. So I analyzed it for that. The coverage goes pretty high. So 14, it's almost 98%. I mean, I'm rounding up there. And for 19, it goes as low as around 74%. So that's really interesting. I'd say it's also quite interesting that lexical difficulties are really high in the narratio, which is actually annoyingly the bulk of our text. Now, as I said, just giving them the vocab does not explain where it's easy, where it's hard. So actually, there's some really horrendous stuff in 5, 6, 7 for at least for our students. So even though the vocab coverage is high, some of the grammatical stuff can be quite annoying, especially because, Cicero sadly did not care about the AS Latin scheme of work. So he's not particularly bothered that we don't cover predicative datives until way later in the year, and they only just know their present subjunctives. But something like this, and again, this is very rough. I'm not a computer scientist. I'm messing around in Python. There are definitely, you can give or take a few percentage points for some of these elements, but it can maybe show you where you expect to spend less time, where you expect to spend more time. So when we get to 19, that is something that I'm going to go into some serious depth with, making sure they really understand that. It can also give you some ideas of where you're going to hammer them in terms of 50 marker practice, translation practice. So for example, something like, I don't know, let's pick a random one like 14 might be quite good for those sort of 50 marker style analysis. But really, if I want to see what they can do in terms of do they know their text, and we're giving them the translation questions, I'm pulling from 19, I'm pulling from 23, and so on and so forth to really keep them on their toes. I should say, by the way, given that almost nowhere do we hit the 98% sort of rate of fairly easy reading, that they really are going to have to work very hard to learn this. But seeing these numbers, I think that so many are in the 90s and 80s. Hopefully, we can all breathe a little sigh of relief that whilst it might be quite difficult, context, stylistic features, that sort of thing, it's not at all unapproachable. So what I thought we would do, and again, these slides will be going your way, so feel free to edit this or disregard it. Is try to talk about what we can do in terms of strategies here. So I think whatever you call specific legal terminology, students really should be asked to learn these. Ideally ASAP. They will come up again and again and again. And as you saw with our examples like overs, windies, and so on and so forth, without having the knowledge of that deep, and to hand, it's going to affect the comprehension of the entire passage. So think of it as an opportunity to build some cultural awareness. You might want to supplement this from other lists. So the one I always like to use is Diedrich's basic vocabulary, which, if a word's on there, it means it's one of the 90-something% most common words in Latin. So there are a couple of words that you can pull from there, or perhaps the 300 verse words, or even the Owen's Pros and Scenes book, whatever unseen words you look. So I basically say there are lots of words that are on this text that aren't part of the AS vocabulary that it is worth them learning. Okay. So, and we've already mentioned the use of something like this in terms of planning assessments and adapting that scheme of work to when they need more help. What I want to do is look at some example passages here, 6 and 13. Why have I chosen this one? I've chosen 6 because that's roughly where talking to people where they are, and actually I quite like it, and it's a really good introduction to the kind of stuff Cicero is doing. 13 I chose because the commentaries are quite bare on this. I'm hoping that means that OCR are very unlikely to give us a 15 marker on this, but let's have a look at it and see what we can make of it. Right, so putting it all together, we get something like this, don't worry, this is a lot of text, and I would never put this much text on a student screen. But what I've done is I've bolded text that they definitely won't know. And by the way, I'm aware of the irony of this, assuming that the kids have mastered the AS vocabulary inside and outside. That is obviously not the case. But just work with me on this. Let's pretend that they have. So black are words that they're absolutely not going to know. In red are words that theoretically they know, but they might be a principal part that they don't recognize. I have yet, oh, okay, once, apart from one kid, I've never had anyone ever recognize from what verb adeptus comes from. Scelus, whether it's a noun or whether it's being used in an adjectival form, always trips them up. Sure, they should know dele or delere. I think that is on the GCSE list, but these sorts of present subjunctives are new to them. That might trip them up. Judices is difficult. Does it mean judge? Does it mean juryman? I was looking at an antiquated translation of this the other day, and it says something like, "Oh, honored gentleman." So that might cause some issues. They are not going to know a construction like honoris causa, yeah, even if that makes sense to them. So straight away, you can kind of see, oh, okay, this is where some of the difficulty is going to be. So, and what I would do, I've broken this down into 3 or 4 sections. I'll work through it fairly quickly, but I'll point out some of the stuff that's interesting in it and what we can do with the kids. So let's look at something like this. I'm really hoping you can see that purple, meaning something that I want to talk about. We use purple for style point, but class after class has told me that my sense of colors is absolutely awful. So apologies if that's the case. So this is a pretty rough translation. You can argue all sorts of issues, but we'll edit it as we go, sort of thing. Right. So what are we drawing attention to? You can see that this is like a small part of it, but we've got a couple of things. Huius used here. I think that's quite a good one. Cicero wants you to pay attention to it because you've got that little particle at the end, huiusque. He's talking about sexus roscius. This is something worth pointing out. This is a speech that was read aloud in, at a trial. There was Cicero, there were the jurymen, there were the judges, there were the prosecutors, and there was Sextus Roscius. So this is a very vivid bit of Deixis. And we should imagine some sort of gesture here. We should imagine that he's pointing to Sextus Roscius. And actually, he tends to use hic, haec, hoc, really, for people, for the defendant, people on his side throughout. So there's your first style point there. And again, you can kind of see what we're doing. So for those of you who've taught previous Cicero speeches, on this specification, I will say, the big bombastic style points that we got with things like Procluentio are missing. So, we're digging for some of these. We've got a bunch of numbers here. We've got sexagiens, which again, students aren't going to know, opposed to duobus, millibus. So this is something worth bringing up. So we're talking that the property, oh, by the way, bona probably should be in red, if we're taking it as a neuter. Bona, the good things really meaning the property. So the property of this man, which is, imagine that this man, his father, which was worth 6 million sesterces, that's going to cause questions. What's the relative value of 6 million sesterces? But again, it's worth pointing out how bombastic a sum this is. I think it's about 800,000 at this time. To be a senator. I think we know very much from the prosopography that, putting the really rich senators like Crassus and Cicero and so on aside, that the typical pattern is, a person is a senator, the money is absolutely exhausted, their son might then be a knight, their grandson might then again become a senator. So that's the reality for most of our senators. So the fact that it's 6 million is, it's a phenomenal amount, as Catherine said, 14 farms or so. And we're told that it was purchased for 2,000. So that in itself is scandalous. Sulla is mentioned. So this is a bit of parenthesis here. And look at the superlatives right after the other. I've went for brave and most famous. Bit clunky, but something like that gets the idea behind it. Why is using superlative for Sulla, whom we are told in parenthesis he names only for the sake of honor. Remember, Sulla is not here. Sulla is retiring wherever his villa was outside of Rome. I can't remember. So, and then the last thing we want to talk about here, well, I suppose you could also talk about the interplay between adolescens and potentissimus. in terms of more superlatives, but this time used perhaps in a sarcastic way, and that is used for Lucius Cornelius Chrysogonos. Um, by the way, I've highlighted the name not just because of the historical context of which Catherine has given us quite a bit, but that is a full that's a trinomen for a freedman, and I do wonder to what degree Cicero again is using this sarcastically. The combination of adolescens, perhaps potentissimus used in a very sarcastic way, it is dismissive in a way. It's a really good way of pointing out that this guy is a cloying parvenu, he's a slave. You can see that in his very name. He's not, in any way actually a member of the gens Cornelia. So that's why I've highlighted that. So again, this is the first bit. We've got, a handful of things where we're really having to milk this section like a lemon, if you forgive the metaphor. Going on to the next one, this whole thing, ut quoniam alienam pecuniam tam plenum atque praeclaram, I've highlighted again because I really want you to remember this is something that is spoken, and when you speak that out loud, the not just the assonance but the that combination of wide vowels and nasals has a serious effect there, and that is something that you really should have the students um, read out loud. We can talk about the use of the plosives there as well, pecuniam, plenam, preclinam, which are very aggressive. Those nasal signs in M also quite aggressive. So they should be able to get a lot out of that. Look at the translation briefly. You can see that I've put some things in brackets and I put some stars next to some of these things. This is an alternative way of getting the set text across that I really like. Every so often, I'll give them a translation which I don't necessarily like, and it might be because something's a bit grammatically or syntactically clunky, or it might be I just don't like the words. For example, obstacle and hindrance, and they're starred. And what I'll have the student do is go away and try and find a nicer way of talking about that. So this is kind of the kind of slide I would use in a lesson. So we've covered the iteration, we've covered the okay, brilliant. Last bit of things I would talk about here is that chiastic structure, which kids, I don't know why they love chiasmus so much. Maybe it's to do with the GCSE, I don't know. But there's that deliatis ex animo, and then the palatis, that's your A and your A, and suspicionem omnem metumque. So that is quite a strong phrasing, and the word order does really help get them across. But again, and I think your students will be able to pick things like this up, but you really should push them on the who cares. Like, what is the effect of this chiastic effect? We could talk about something like, if you're practicing sentences and paragraphs for exams, we might say something like it mirrors the way that Chrysogonus, despite being an evil man, wants to be surrounded by safety, or something like that, or how he's got his fingers everywhere. I mean, they can phrase it better than that, but you get the idea. So similar thing here. I mean, there's comparatively less in terms of style points here in this, and that's fine. Not every sort of thing is going to have everything. I think the ones that we do have here are tiny bit weaker. Look, we can talk about the antithesis between incolumi and innocentis, for example, but I wouldn't spend over long on this. I think some of the vocabulary isn't in itself. If we could talk about Lexis, is quite good. What he obtains through crime, he wants to effundere. So I've given squander here, but it's literally, to pour out. We could talk about luxury, especially being against stern Republican Roman morals and the kind of thing you expect an Oriental or a woman or a slave to be concerned with. And we can even talk about how Cicero is clearly trying to build a contrast in the minds of the jury between the lovely rustic farm life of his client versus this evil Chrysogonus. Last bit of this, lovely Maryism, dies noctesque, and of course, scrupulous is a very weird word. It's definitely not going to be on the vocabulary list. So I've translated as a stone. I've seen that some dictionary taken as like a little pebble. Either way, there's a little metaphor here, and again makes the defendant look really small, really innocent, much put upon. Brings up that language of being an obstacle. Again, the merism is, it shows sort of. I mean, it's almost like one of anxiety, obsession, guilt, and then again some of that moral imagery with that from Nefas Nefarium. So before I go on to the next one, does that make sense? Let me try and make this big again, see if there's any questions that I need to pick up. Or am I okay to go to the next one?
Good to keep going. If anyone
Good.
does have any questions, and we have got a couple of questions, but I think these probably are more for Catherine, so we can pick these up towards the end.
Brilliant.
But for now, if we're happy to keep going,
Should I go on with the sort of the next one? Should we go straight to sort of examination? I'm looking at the time.
We've got some time, so if you think
Okay.
there's something worth having a look at in 13, that would be great.
Okay, well, I'll just spend a little time looking at 13. Look, I hope that I'm making sense. I know I'm quite going fast. I'm just trying to make sure we don't keep you guys too long. Here's 13. Again, this is not something you'd ever put up on the thing, but black words that they're not going to know, and you can see straight away there's a lot more here. Red is something that individually they may know, but when you put it together, it's quite difficult. So 13, I want to look at really briefly, simply because the commentaries aren't very fulsome on this, and there's no reason to expect there would be. But I think there are a few things that an A-level student can really get out of this. You might straight away notice that tricolor accusant, which again, kids love tricolor. So there is something very rhythmic to this, and that combination of antithesis and tricolon throughout this makes this a really good thing to read aloud. So really do get them to do this. Right. So here's our first thing. So again, it's very bold. I mean, this is what the Dike commentary says: "Etenim quid aliud hoc judicio temptatur nisi," and so on and so forth. That is a very bold statement. How is he going to actually validate this? And you can go on to see how he does this. Acusant a qui. And this, by the way, acusant a, it carries on through. And what he's doing is constantly building this antithesis between the evil ne'er-do-wells who are accusing him, and then our lovely defendant. So the ones who are actually the accusers here, they're the ones who have committed the crime. They're the ones who have seized the property. And again, in Waserunt, and again, there's some sort of puts in here in Waserunt, reliquerunt. In Waserunt is a very sorry, it's a very strong word, obviously where we get invade from. Again, this is something I would task the kids to deal with. Causam dicit is effectively a legal formula. I swear in English we would probably just say something like the defendant is one who, so the accusers are X, the defendant is Y, but that was something that you might have them commit to memory. So we've got that. We've got a disjunction between fortuna and calamitas here. Going on to the next bit. Again, this part is more mainly Lexis. Luctus. Luctus is a word they should know anyway, but they accuse him for whom the murder of Sextus Roscius' father was advantageous. It was a bono. This is worth spending some time over, because obviously, predictive data, if they're not going to know that, you will have to spend time on that. And the defendant is one for whom the death of his father brought not only luctus, but truly also poverty, lack. And this is the penultimate bit. Similar thing here with the finishing of a tricolon, but again, some of the verbs here. Jugulare, I've translated as slaughter. I know dictionaries will have kill, but jugulare is not really a verb you use very often. It means to cut someone's throat, etymologically, to slit their throat. So it's quite a bit stronger than neko or kido, right? So that's something we can talk about, the visual imagery there. And actually, this bit ends quite, it's very, what's the word I'm looking for? It is very visual, that, he may be butchered right here before your eyes. And again, the verb for butchered, trucido, is the kind, I mean, just looking for the TLR, it's the kind of thing that you use for animals, really. So there's something strong there. And again, we're seeing nefari again, kaide, less here than in other sections, but still we can get something for it. So hopefully, I know it was a quick run through, but hopefully that was quite useful. Let's talk about assessments really briefly, because I know that this is something that there's a lot of anxiety over. Current students will be the first of only 2 years to sit the set text. We don't really have good mock questions. We don't have exemplars. The examiner's reports can sometimes be a bit opaque. How do we get around this? I went through all the Cicero questions over the last sort of 5 years, and I've pulled them out. So the left-hand um, column are the ones that appear in part A, so that's the AS text. The right-hand columns are the ones that appear in part B, that's your A2 text. And I just wanted to see if there's any sort of pattern here that we can write our own papers for. Some of these you can kind of see can be lifted almost verbatim. So how does Cicero make this a dramatic account of events? You can use that for almost any section. How does Cicero make this passage a vigorous attack on Antony? Well, swap Antony for Chrysogonos, for example. How does Cicero make this dramatic? They love the word dramatic for the prose generally, not just Cicero. How does Cicero ridicule the young man? I mean, maybe, I don't know, that can be adapted slightly. You'll notice that the stuff for year two is tiny bit more complex. It tends to be something like they'll give you the passage line specifically again, because obviously with the A2 you've got a really big chunk of text. I've certainly found our students, at least on mocks, will often ignore 1 to 12 and they say, well, I quite like, 13 and 14, I'm getting that in. So maybe that's something they can start training them on. But it's kind of a similar thing here. Look at the language here: powerful attack, outrage, and so on and so forth. So some of these can be directly adapted, and that's certainly what we'll be doing here at Reading Bluecoat. And I don't know, maybe if I write the question pack, I can put it online for you guys to grab. I don't know. 20 markers. How effective? They love this word effective. I don't think I've ever met a student who naturally knows what it means. Effective in what way? But look at how effective do you find Cicero's defense? Easily adaptable. What makes Cicero's speech so successful? Easily adaptable. How fair is it to criticize Cicero for spending more time attacking Saskia than defending Clementius? That is a 20 marker that readily adapts itself to this text, because rather than talking about how innocent Sextus Roscius is, he spends so much talking about how actually it's the prosecutors who are the bad guys and there's a whole conspiracy. That can be flipped around. Philippic II was one of the most admired of Cicero's work in ancient times. Why? Flip that around to something like, why does nobody read this? And you've got a 20 marker. He is so driven by emotions that he offers no reason arguments. Again, you can flip that around slightly. Cicero relies more on conspiracy and emotion than he does on reason. How far do you agree? And then you've got a 20 marker there. So for those of you who are looking for ideas, hopefully that helps a little bit. Hopefully that helps with those particular sections. I'm not really sure, but if you have any questions, please fire away.
That was wonderful, Jas. Thanks so much. I mean, you rattle through an awful lot there, but I think there's a lot of tips there that hopefully people can take away to embed into their teaching, if they're starting it this year or if actually they're getting prepared to start next September. If you do have any questions for Jas, please do put those in the chat or raise your hand and you can unmute. I am just going to go back to a couple of questions that we have in the chat that I think, Catherine, I'm going to come back to you if you're happy to answer these. We have one question from Emma who asks, to what extent would the religious polluting element of the crime make the charge hard to dislodge, even if he took the defence of Roscius Senior being on the list? Would offending the gods make it go beyond what Sulla could legislate on?
That's a really interesting question, because of course one of the things that you could, one of the things that is I suppose technically true, is it could, everything that Cicero says in this speech by way of defence could be true, and Roscius could still be guilty. Right. So that there is a disconnect, I think, between the crime itself and the fact that Cicero says remarkably little really about the nature of the elder Roscius's death, and instead we get this whole story. So I think that is true to the extent that using the prescription defence would have led to Roscius's acquittal, but it might not have cleared anything else up. Because after all, technically, I suppose, he could have done his father to death even after he'd been put on the prescriptions list. But having said all that, I mean, I think first of all, Cicero himself is making a great deal out of parricide as an offence. And I'm not sure that we should necessarily believe everything he says about it in terms of the enormity of the crime. I mean, later on in his career, he kind of laughs about this passage because it's so overblown. And he recognises that. At the time, he must have thought there is an emotion here that I can use. I can try and ramp up the emotion to make conviction look really serious, and that may not have really fed into how the case was looking as it developed. So I'm not sure I have a really decisive answer for that question, but I think on balance, that cannot be the driver. I don't think it was sufficient a problem on its own that Cicero or indeed Roscius would have thought we can't use the cast iron defence. I think there must be something else behind that, and I suspect that is to do with property as well as reputation. And of course, we don't know how that played out. Yeah,
Catherine. Emma, I hope that helps answer your question. We also have another question from Richard, who asks, would it be possible to give more information on how the prosecution and defence could make challenges to the makeup of the jury? I know that Cicero refers to this in Verem 1.
Yes, well, I think if we're thinking about the same passage, what he's talking about in Verem is a slightly different dodge. There were different albums for each court, it seems. But sometimes a particular set of senators that had been assigned to a particular quaestio would, for whatever reason, lose numbers during the course of the year, because these were done on an annual basis, because magistracies are annual, so there'd be a particular praetor in charge of a court, and everything would switch over at the end of December. And it looks as though, and I've just got this all out of Greenwich legal procedure, it looks as though what Cicero is saying Verres tried to do was that if a particular jury was running, if a particular quaestio was running short of jurors, there seems to have been a mid-year provision that you could allocate jurors from another quaestio to the one that was short of numbers. I think it's called subsortitio, a kind of secondary allocation. And in the Verines, I think Cicero is saying that Verres tried to get that to happen because that would have removed some jurors whom he thought were going to be hostile to him from the quaestio de repetundis and moved them somewhere else. But the challenge of jurors does seem to have been permitted. I think it was normally 3. A defendant, both prosecution and defendant could challenge up to 3 jurors, and that would mean they didn't hear the case. But interestingly, a senator seems to have been allowed to challenge 6. And I suppose the rationale for that was that somebody in public life would be more likely to have enemies. And therefore, it was fair to allow him greater scope in terms of rejection. But as I say, I have all of this out of Greenwich Legal Procedure of Cicero's time, which very helpfully is now available online as a PDF through the internet, the archive.org site. So any fiddly questions about legal procedure I think it's still fairly safe to go to Greenwich for the answer, even though that book is now 125 years old. It is still, very helpful.
I think it just leaves me to say thank you both to Jas and Catherine for this afternoon's presentations. Good night.